everyone, and welcome to part 7 of my series on how to tune cars in BeamNG.drive. And this one we are focusing on drag cars. You can turn pretty much anything into a drag vehicle. Literally anything. They even use ATVs and snowmobiles and so on. I will be turning the Legrand into a drag car because there isn't a vanilla one yet. So, as usual, same in the other parts, I will be starting off with changing the parts. We want to prioritize lightweight, lots of torque and horsepower, and we will want wide tires so that we can get the traction and the power onto the ground and not just spin our tires when we leave the line. So let's get through this bit. I will also mention really quick that, as I mentioned in the other ones, I'm not using my typical recording setup, so audio and video quality isn't the greatest, but I did fix the microphone issue that I had in the other ones. It was set to use my controller microphone, not the normal one. So I've got that fixed. Hopefully you can actually hear me and understand me better now. So either way, I'm going to get through this. And another thing I'll mention is leave anti-lock braking off until we tune the brakes. So yeah, let's get through this part. Okay, that should be pretty much it for parts. One thing I should have mentioned is that if you are using a rear-wheel drive car, you will want nice wide tires on the back and skinny tires on the front so that the front has less rolling resistance and so on. If you're using a front-wheel drive car, wide tires on the front, skinny on the back. Since I am using an all-wheel drive car, I am using fairly wide tires on the front and the back. As long as your wheel diameter is the same, I'm using 15s, as long as they're the same on the front and back, the width doesn't matter too much, as long as your sidewall stays the same. I think these are both 45. So, as usual, I will now move on to the brakes. I also should have upgraded the engine, which I completely forgot to do, so I will do that now. Okay, now that the engine is also upgraded, you'll want to have, as I mentioned before, good horsepower and good torque and RPM. And then, yeah, so let's get on to the brakes. As I usually do, like in my previous videos, is I like to have it so that my front wheels lock up just before the rear wheels, and then I like to have the brake force multiplier, or my brake pressure, set so that they lock up when the trigger is pulled all the way. Not half, not quarter, whatever, at full. That way I have more control over the brakes. So let's get up to speed and slam on the brakes. And there is way too much pressure to the rear. I'm going to move over here really quick, just to make things a little faster. Okay. So I need to move the bias forwards a little bit. Let's see how 5% does. Oops. Putting it in gear would help. And the rear brakes are still locking up. And that didn't change my home position. Since the recent update, I hasn't been resetting the car as it should. I should go in and check the settings, the control layout, because the new T-Series uses I and G, I believe it is, or I and K or something, to lift and lower the rear suspension. So I will go here and do Control R, and hopefully that will change it. And it's still locking up the back brakes. We'll just leave the home position here for now. I forget how to change it. It doesn't really matter right now anyways. Did I put on the correct brakes all the way around? Excuse me. Front suspension. Race, oops. Race brakes, race pads, race brakes and pads on the rear. So that's fine. Some of the vehicles have drag race, either drums or discs. I do not like using those because it applies way too much pressure to the rear end. But that's because still too much to the back. But it's not as bad now. But that's because as you get bigger, wider tires, they require more torque to slow them down. So I will up this a little bit and then move on to the rest of the car. Okay, that's fine for now. And since they aren't locking up at all, I don't need to adjust the brake pressure. But as I said, if they are locking up, slowly reduce the pressure until they only lock up at like 95% of your trigger or your pedal. And then adjust the bias as you need to make it so that the front wheels have a little bit more brake pressure than the back. I'm going to reduce the fuel volume to, let's say, 10 liters for weight reduction. The differentials I'm going to keep it 50-50, and then make the lock rate 50 as well, and then coast I usually set to 0. The front I typically set coast and preload to 0, and then I'm going to set this to 50 as well, and then the rear I'm going to set to 50 and leave these how they are, because that should be okay for this. And then engine RPM limit, as I've mentioned in other videos, max that all the way out, and then we will apply what we've done. And then we will go down and use either the normal pack or the engine debug app, which I have in the bottom left, and slowly raise the RPMs until we get the over rev warning. Which in this looks to be about 7,000. So now we go in and change our tuning so that the rev limit is at 7,000. The heavy duty block, I believe, can have more torque and it can handle more boost. However, it has a lower RPM. The stage blocks or performance blocks can handle a higher RPM but less boost and torque. Nitrous, I'm going to leave how it is at the moment. Basically, as you are going, you want to go full throttle, and the first gear that you aren't spinning the tires in full throttle, set that to your nitrous gear. Suspension, the anti-roll bars or sway bars are pretty much fine. We're not doing any cornering, so we don't really need to worry about that. Typically we might want to stiffen the rear end to stop it from squatting. So I'll apply this, and I'll show what I mean. As you accelerate in a car, the weight moves back. So if I hit the throttle, you can see the rear end squats down. We want to minimize that a little bit, but also use it to our advantage. If it squats too much, you can bottom out and you can lose some of your acceleration and so on. If it's too stiff, it'll leave not enough weight on the back, and then you won't be able to use the weight transfer to your advantage, and you'll just spin your tires and so on. So it's one of those things you gotta play with a little bit. So I'm going to up my bump dampening to 4,000. I'm going to increase my spring rate by 1,000, and it looks like my ride height is currently sitting at negative 0.7, meaning there's almost 1 degree of what is it, pitch? Yeah, pitch angle, or rake for some reason they call it. So now that I've increased the springs, I'm going to lower the ride height. I'm also going to lower the ride height in the front. The lower your car, the more aerodynamic it is, the less air can get under it, and the faster you can go. I'm going to move a little bit so the wheels aren't stuck in the ground. Lower it a little bit more. Okay, there we go. It's the same, roughly the same, but lower. Another thing is, you don't want a huge wing on the back. You do want a little bit of downforce, so you can help improve your grip, but too much downforce will start to cause too much drag and slow you down. The transmission. Typically in drag racing, a manual is a little bit faster because you can rev a little higher and so on. However, an automatic has the advantage of it can shift faster, which is what you want. You want to accelerate as fast as you can. So I went with the sequential because I hate automatic. And then the torque converter and the way automatics work can also reduce your power a lot. So usually dual clutch or sequential is best. The gear ratios, you want to be nice and close together. I will explain that in a moment, but I would first like to change my wheel offset because it is bugging me a little bit having them stick out. So I'm going to start with 0.005 and see how far that moves them in. It doesn't really matter if they stick out, but aerodynamics, if they stick out too much, it'll of course again cause some drag and slow you down. You want to be as aerodynamic as you can be. I'll probably have to end up bringing them in as far as I can. The back are almost perfect, but the front need to come in more. So I'm going to go 0.02 on the rear and probably 0.015 on the back. Like so, that looks okay to me. I could probably still lower the front a little bit as well. I'm going to move forwards a tiny bit so that I can see. Yeah, I'm going to lower the front a tiny bit. Your front shocks don't matter too much unless your vehicle's doing wheelies. If your vehicle is doing wheelies, you definitely want to increase your bump damping so that when it comes back down you don't bottom out and take out your oil pan. I am, however, going to increase the rebound damping by 1,000 so that as I take off the line it doesn't lift up the front as much. And then our alignment. I will get to the gear ratios after. For alignment, you want your wheels to be nice and flat on the ground so that you can have as much of a contact patch as we can as we're going straight. We're not really cornering, so your cornering handling doesn't really matter in this, as long as you can turn at the end of the track and come back on the return road. So I've removed the Wheels Debug app that I usually use because I noticed you can select it here. So open up the Wheels Debug, and we want the toe and the camber to basically be 0. So I'm going to increase the camber and the toe a little bit at a time. The rear toe can come in. With drag racing, we, as I mentioned, aren't really turning, so we don't need toe out to help us turn. We want straight line stability. So we want the wheels to point in ever so slightly to help us go in a straight line, but too much will cause wear on the tires and will create more drag and rolling resistance. So I can bring camber in some more. Another thing, as I mentioned in the rally video, is some vehicles have what's called bump steer because of the suspension geometry. And what that is as the suspension cycles, if the tie rod and your links aren't on the same axis, which this looks like it should be okay, but if they aren't, if you look over here as I lift the car, you can see that it's towing out. As I squish it down, or no, sorry, as I lift it, it's towing in a little bit. As I squish it down, it is towing out. That is bump steer. It steers as you go over bumps. That we kind of want to keep in mind, because when you're coming off the line and your wheels go toe out, it can cause the front end to wander and you won't be going in a straight line anymore, or it'll be a lot harder to go in a straight line. Try and get this closer to 0. Okay, so the rear is at 0, so I'm going to tow it in back up to 5, so it has a little bit of tow. And then the rear end, or the front end, is still towed out. I have a feeling I'm going to want 20 to 25. Yeah, 20 is straight, so I'm going to go with, actually I'm going to go with about 23 and see how it turns out. Yeah, that's not bad. I'm gonna go for about 0.1 on the toe. So let's go 25 and 10. Alright, that's too much on the rear, but just about right on the front. On a vehicle with straight axles, or at least a straight axle in the back, you won't have to deal with this because they are, of course, straight on the straight axle. So that is good enough for me, and then I'm going to take out some more of the camber. I'm going to reduce the back end to 0, and then bring the front up to 15. And then the caster doesn't matter too much. Wow, that's still way off. Go up by 10 on the back and another 5 on the front. Okay, I'm fairly happy with the front. We'll want a little bit of toe in, or camber in, but not too much. Also, if your vehicle happens to do wheelies, if you've got too much camber, it can cause extra wear and stress on parts when you land that we don't need. And then again with bump steer, if you do wheelies and your wheels toe out when you land, it can cause you to go off to the side and so on. So the rear is actually towed in a bit now, or cambered in, which I don't want. So I'm going to reduce that to 16, see what we get. Good enough for me. Okay. Let's test this out, and then we will get to the transmission. The final drive and the transmission are where you really gain your speed and such. So, if you're only two-wheel drive, you will want to come back here, and in a front-wheel drive car, you can typically just hold handbrake and then dump the clutch, and you'll spin the front tires. You want to do this to heat them up, and you'll have more grip. With a rear-wheel drive vehicle, you will want to see if we can do that with this. You'll want to set your brake line lock. Oh, we can turn on ABS again, by the way. But you will want to set your brake line lock, if you have it, to the rear tires, which this does not have. And what that does is it disables the brakes on the rear end when active, only locking the front, allowing you to do a burnout and not mess up the brakes, which I believe is Control-Alt-Space or Shift-Control-Alt-Space. Not sure. I'd recommend going into the settings and then the vehicle controls and seeing what it is for you. So, as I said, do your little burnout and so on. If you are driving an automatic, come up to the line and activate trans brake. What that does, that again could be Control-Shift-Alt-Space or Control-Alt-Space or whatever you have it set to. Once you come up to the line, turn on your trans brake if you have it, only automatics do, and that basically puts it in between reverse and first, so that you can load up the engine, build your boost, and then on the green light you deactivate it and you launch with a nice high RPM, high boost, as much power as you can get off the line. It can lead to broken parts, but it's a lot better than doing a neutral drop. In a manual, you tend to just dump the clutch. So we come up to the line. Now that our tires are preheated, it's kind of hard to preheat the tires in a all-wheel drive car, but whatever. So at the line, like I said, line lock if you have it. If not, we'll just kind of dump the clutch. And then this is one of those things that depends on the car. If you rev too high before dumping the clutch, or have too high of a stall on your torque converter, you can either just spin your tires, or if you have enough grip, you'll end up doing a massive wheelie. So depending on the car you have and your setup, you'll have to kind of figure out where the best RPM and boost is for your car to launch at. So if I just go to 7 grand and dump the clutch, we didn't spin the tires, so I can just kind of go down the track and see how it does. Not too bad, 165 in the quarter. So, we only ended up in 4th gear. And since it's a sequential, we can just pull it back and shift every time we need to. Some drag vehicles only have 2 gears or 3 gears, but they also have the power and the torque for that. We don't. So, I am going to increase the final drive. Let's go with 4. 4 to 1. It'll lower our top speed, but give us more torque for the acceleration. So let's try this. Might even spin the tires this time. I'm also going to activate the nitrous. You can see the purge on the front. So it automatically goes off in 2nd, I think this car is set to. Or you can set it to a manual button. I also have it set to circle, or what would be B or something on the Xbox controller. I'm using a PlayStation controller. Either way. So I'm going to rev again and do a run and see how it goes. Awesome. So, that's the kind of interesting thing with drag racing. I increased the torque, but I got a higher top speed. That's because we have such a short distance to use, a quarter mile. It's usually 1/8 mile, quarter mile, or sometimes a half mile. So increasing the torque allows me to get to a higher top speed within the distance we have. And then again, if you're doing wheelies, you can adjust the rear suspension, whether it needs to be a little bit softer to soak up the torque, or it needs to be stiffer. If you're just spinning your tires, try lowering your tire pressure, but if you lower your tire pressure too much, you will start to cause more rolling resistance, which will, of course, cause you to be slower. So I'm going to increase the torque a little bit more, and then go again. I'm also going to lower the RPM a little bit, because coming off the line, it's giving me the over rev warning, and we don't want that. We also want it to be reliable, so we can do multiple runs, one after another. In top fuel drag racing, they use V8s that are making about 8,000 RPM, or 8,000 horsepower. That's literally 1,000 horsepower per cylinder. And in between each run, they completely take apart the engine and rebuild it to make sure it's not broken and so on. So let's try another run. Not sure if I got a higher top speed that time or not. It's another one of those things that you have to kind of play with, because at a certain point you're not getting much benefit out of having more torque. So once you stop getting a higher top speed from the torque, try reducing it a little bit and seeing what your top speed is if you reduce it a bit. And again, if you're spinning your tires too much, you could also try reducing the power lock on your differential, but you want to make sure your rear differential does lock up so that you have power going to both wheels equally. I'm going to do one more run and then I'll end the video, but hopefully this has helped at least a little bit. Yeah, see, I got to the same speed that time. So I'd say this car is pretty much where it's gonna get at the moment. It's a decent car. And yeah, just kinda fiddle with your settings. If your car's not going quite in a straight line, it's wandering to the sides too much, give it a little bit of toe in. You don't want too much camber, minimal camber, so that you have a nice flat, strong contact patch. Another thing you could try, if you can fit them, if you're spinning your tires, try putting wider tires on it. If your tires are too wide for how much power you have, that can also slow you down, because you have to not only move the mass of the car, you also have to get the tires rotating. So yeah, hopefully everything I've mentioned in this video can help with your understanding of drag racing, your parts setup. Typically, if you have a straight axle in the back, typically a 3 or 4 link is also better than leaf springs, because leaf springs can twist under load and so on. I'll show that in a moment. And yeah, if I was using a turbocharger, typically with those what I recommend is set the boost as high as you can go, and then get the car into your last gear, whether it's 5 or 6, however many you have, and slowly build the boost. And then once the overboost warning comes up, lower your boost to where it's at when the boost warning comes up, and then go from there and just keep adjusting it. And then, like I said, use your line lock for your burnouts if you can, if you have automatic, the trans brake for your launch, and so on. So yeah, I will save this, switch to something with a leaf spring, and kind of show that really quickly. But either way, as usual, I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.